Because I really do your unique perspective on the ethnic church and
Mm-hmm.
and the nuances of what that closeness and that intimacy that you speak of
Mm-hmm.
there, um, how that often is seems incompatible with that public
Mm-hmm.
sphere. I just want to read this quote from
Mm-hmm.
Parker Palmer's book because I think it really relates to what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And it says this, he says, it's just a paragraph here. It says, the problem arises when closeness and warmth become the criteria of all meaningful relations. When we reject and fear relationships which do not yield to these standards. The problem arises when we impose the norm of intimacy, which
Mm-hmm.
applies primarily to the private life, upon
Mm-hmm.
the public sphere. For
Mm-hmm.
within the public realm, where most relations are necessarily distant, this is his perspective, by the way, I
Mm-hmm.
would challenge too, is necessarily distant and impersonal. The demand for closeness and warmth distorts and eventually destroys the potential of public experience. We are
Mm-hmm.
double-minded. We want, to personalize the public experience to make it less fearsome, yet
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously fearing the consequences of protection of our own personalities onto the public scene. And this is another part of the quote. He says, we must learn to accept and appreciate the fact that the public life is fundamentally impersonal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we both know like particular Asian cultures. Just imagining,
Mm-hmm.
like I've been to some Korean church retreats, and it's let's say the world is looking on. It's borderline inappropriate, these pranks, and the
Uh,
ways in which the amount of touch that occurs. All right,
mm-hmm.
I just gotta say, it's even beyond like the Indonesians, anyways. But there's certain things that happen that's like, whoa, this is only happening in this culture, right? And that sense of intimacy, it seems like if I can't do that with every
Mm-hmm.
people in the public, then everything that happens in the public is kind of fake. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of artificial. And we
Mm-hmm.
write off the public engagement because, as he says here, we're using the standard of intimacy in here in order to engage with the public. And if we're not receiving that, then I'm just going to speak to you as a professional. I'm going to engage with you as a coworker, and we turn this on. And it's as if again, back to that zero sum game, as I said theologically, we can do that with regards to intimacy as well. Like and so, how have you found that cultural element of like an immigrant church is just an example of the
Mm-hmm.
particularities of an immigrant church engaging with the universal audience? How do you reconcile that in what he
Mm-hmm.
was saying?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think he's really trying to redeem the value of public engagement as not just being like fake, artificial
Mm-hmm.
selves with a facade out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm really curious what kind of church experience Parker Palmer had too, because he's just like ranting on his soapbox, right? Like something must have happened in this man's lifetime
Well,
that
just
made him this, fiercely against the cult of intimacy. But yeah, I think when we look at ethnic churches, something that I observed was kind of this theology of belonging is kind of how I quote, how I phrased it. It's we're all searching for this deep belonging, right? And we want to belong to family. And I think being immigrants in Canada, you feel like an alien, you feel like a stranger. Even though I was born here, there are certain places in the public when I go and I just don't feel myself, like you said. And so it's
mm,
really questioning and asking ourselves, is the church a place of belonging just for you? And
mhm,
just for the ethnic people to find a place of home. And if we want to go beyond that, what kind of mind frame do we need to come to embrace to be able to go beyond that? And something that really struck me was this idea of, when Jesus says, when you lose yourself is when you will actually find it, right?
mhm,
And this is kind of tied to Parker Palmer's idea of you look for the stranger in the public because in the stranger, you will experience a deeper understanding of yourself. That as you engage with people who are not like you're
mhm,
able to uncover things of yourself that you wouldn't be able to uncover if, say, you were just always with people that were like you. If you were in a community where you're just always comfortable and you're always with those that are just like yourself. And so, something that I've come to really take in and to reflect on is as immigrants and as ethnic people, as people who feel like strangers in a way, like in Canada. And then for me, I go to Korea and I feel like a stranger too. I don't really
mm,
belong anywhere. I'm here and I feel Korean. I go to Korea and I feel so Canadian. I'm like, I am not Korean. And so you're kind of caught in this third space where you're not this or that.
Mhm.
And I really think ethnic immigrant individuals, we have this intimate experience of what it feels like to be like an alien, of being a stranger. I
Mhm.
mean, our parents' generation, who actually were aliens, you know, they came as immigrants to this foreign land. Um, we have this intimacy with the stranger. And so, how do we hone that and how do we harness that to see ourselves as strangers who can make belonging for other strangers?
Mhm.
So, it's not doing away with, you know, the kind of communal mindset we have and the parts about our culture that, you know, just are very sticky. You know, the Asians are very sticky. We like to stick together, we like to spend time together. So it's not about doing away with those things, but it's in the midst of that, how do you find the source of what causes you to crave for that place of family and that place of home? And then how do you extend the boundary to whom that is being given to? So
Mhm.
rather than creating a place of belonging just for other immigrants like me, how do I extend that to other strangers who are also looking for a place of home, who have
Mhm.
that same sense of displacement, that same sense of, you know, I don't belong. And you see that, like, I think when I go out and I meet other immigrants, even though they're not Korean, you feel a sense of like closeness because you
Mhm.
kind of have that sameness sense of, oh, I don't belong anywhere. And yet maybe together we can belong together, right? Like
Mhm.
together we can create a place of belonging. And I like to think of these kind of third spaces as almost, you know, the word liminal is like very hot these days, the idea of liminality, where you're not quite here, you're not quite there, you're like in between, right? And
Mhm.
so, in how do we create in between spaces as ethnic people in church where it's not just about being Korean or being Christian and then we make our own little enclaves and then we're safe and protected, but how do you create a third space where you can still be that stranger and find belonging together, but then it's a place where you believe bring other strangers in too, and then together you create a place of belonging. Together you really encounter Jesus in that uncomfortable feeling of, I'm not this or that and I don't really belong anywhere, but hey, you know what? Together Jesus is saying, when you lose yourself, you find yourself. Jesus is saying, I'm found in that person that is lost, that is, you know, not knowing where to go. Then together maybe we can find ourselves in Jesus and we can create that belonging together. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And just to add another layer,
mhm,
because here's there's first generation immigrant churches, and
mhm,
then there's the second gen that starts their English ministries,
mhm,
or they just leave their churches and go to some multi-ethnic church,
mhm,
and begin that kind of world there. So this, what I really want to get to is really this idea of crossing not only cultural kind of boundaries or strangers that are outside of culture, but also socioeconomic differences
mhm,
as well, and where they are in social status, or whatnot in society. And I find that's the other layer. So it's like not only does ethnic churches of a particularity need to cross boundaries, because you'll have sometimes a second gen church like an English ministry call themselves a multicultural church because they have a token white guy, or a token brown guy or whatever coming into it. And it's like, we're multicultural. When it's really like those people are just like attracted perhaps to the Asian culture, or they marry in.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
They just put up with us. They put up with us. They
Yeah.
just had to stay.
So then there is that. It's literally just still monocultural. It has
Mhm,
multi-ethnic, but it's actually still monocultural, and people are assimilating and drinking bubble tea or eating kimchi or whatnot. And they're doing that. That's good. There's one aspect of that. And then there's going beyond that and actually becoming a multi-ethnic church where we start to embrace different kind of cultures and become multi-ethnic church. And I even find that that is still possible and easier than embracing the socioeconomic diversity, which is another layer where you have someone who might be homeless together with like a middle or upper class family, and reconciling that together. And so I feel like the distance for an immigrant church to kind of go through all those layers is
mhm,
a huge thing. And with that in mind, okay, just keep that in mind. The other thing I was talking to Rick Tobias about in a previous podcast, we were talking about the fact that in Deuteronomy, God makes a declaration to say, look after your poor, to the Israelites, and saying
mhm,
to the Israelites, look after your poor. He wasn't saying to the general world, he was saying to your poor. and the sense of ownership that the Israelites have to their own poor people. And when he said that, I was like, what's an interesting thing, Rick, is that I find that if you're a multi-ethnic church trying to like reach the city and to all cultures, to all nations, for example, whatnot, which is a good ambition, when you try to be everything to everybody, it's like you feel like no ownership, almost no ownership because there's too many. But the thing I find with ethnic churches to their own kind, which is good and bad, is that like I remember my dad going and picking up, people from the airport who he's never met before or seen, or someone just told him to pick someone up from the airport who's an
Yeah.
Indonesian immigrant who's coming into, and my dad would pick them up and they would just like
Yep.
get along and bring them in. It's as if like if it's your own people, there is something there with ethnic churches that will take people in because there's like that
Mhm.
you're my person, you're I don't own you, but you're someone who I feel responsibility to.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
now the question is, how would like an ethnic church actually feel the responsibility or the feeling of that to people in their community, which is like most ethnic churches are not locally parish driven. They're quite, they go like they're commuter churches a lot of the times. How do they
Mhm.
feel that ownership of those people who are in poverty? And so, sorry, I just went
Mhm.
a lot of different things there, but like, what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think this is, I mean, this could be for even non-ethnic churches, right? The
Yeah.
challenge of getting out of your own, demographic, and how do you reach out to people who are outside of your norm and what you're comfortable with? Like that's the real stranger, right? I
Hmm.
mean, just because the color of your skin is different doesn't mean someone automatically feels like a stranger. If someone's life pattern is totally different, that's a real stranger. And
Hmm.
Greg Okeson, he's a public missiologist, and he came up with
Mm.
this idea of thick public engagement, right? Thick. And he's kind of saying how in the churches, our understanding of the gospel has become so thin. And this kind of comes back to this idea of we become bilingual, in
Mm.
that our understanding of ourselves, our purpose, of what we are called to do in this world has become so influenced not by scripture, but by the norms of this world, by the norms of culture, by materialism, or all the things that we need to do to succeed in North America. And I think this especially is true in ethnic churches, that our generation, like the second generation, feels you need to have this success. You need to have,
Hmm.
this do better than your parents did in order to make up for all the sacrifices they made. And so we have these other voices that are speaking to us. And yet in the churches, our understanding and engagement with the gospel has become so thin, in that it's become very much just for Sunday. Like we don't go deeper into the questions of how do I engage with the homeless stranger that I see on the way to work? Like we don't engage in those questions as much. And what he is arguing, Greg Okeson, is he's saying that the public is full of thick narratives, that it is a complex world out there.
Mm.
And when we go out into the public, it's not just one dimensional. I mean, people come from so many different contexts and backgrounds with so many different stories and narratives. And yet we're being equipped with this very thin understanding of the
Mm.
gospel. So we go out with this thin gospel, and then we're encountered with this like thick public with all its complexity and all its
Yes.
challenges, and we're just not equipped. We don't even know what to say. It's like
Yeah.
we run
Four
away,
spiritual
or
laws. Here's the
yeah,
four
force
spiritual laws to your, yeah.
yeah, or gospel on the hand that we
Yeah.
learned when we were like 5, but we don't know how to engage. We don't know how to understand and speak the language of this thick public. And so I think coming back to ethnic churches or
Mm.
just churches in general, like how do we equip ourselves with the language of scripture to specifically give us the tools we need to engage with the stranger? And Leslie Newbigin goes very specific into this of like he's like, you need to have classes for every kind of like a doctor, a teacher, if
Mm.
you work with the homeless, if you're a garbage collector, like all these people need to be equipped with the language of scripture for their context.
Oh, wow.
You need to
Yeah.
have like a specific script that you can go with, so you have this confidence of, hey, I have this thick understanding of the gospel, so when I go out and I engage with people who have these thick complex narratives, I can meet them where they are. It's not like I have to fall back on this really thin understanding of who I am in Jesus, but when you have a fullness of not just understanding with your mind, but experiencing it in the church, you experience the fullness of the truth of Jesus,
Hmm.
then you can go out and you just be yourself and you speak what you know. And in that way, you're able to encounter the complexity of the public world, the complex narratives of those people who may come from such different backgrounds as yourself, and a conversation can actually take place. And